Okay, we'll begin in 5 minutes. And next week I'll post the take-home test online on the 30th. So the take-home test will involve some short answer questions. So you will be asked to define concepts from the readings like biopolitics or gendered disposability, and the concepts will be directly from the readings, and you will be asked to write a short paragraph to define each concept. So I'll post the test online next week, the 30th, and you'll have 1 week to answer the questions. So, the reading this week looks at Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics, and it's something I think I've discussed in previous lectures. So, biopolitics is a way of governing a population. So, it refers to um, the government's interest in our health, and it is a way of um, building a nation. So, a good example is the Canadian healthcare system. That healthcare in Canada is free if you stay in Canada and claim citizenship. And even if you work outside of Canada, you can still access Canadian healthcare as long as you pay Canadian taxes and you spend at least, I think, a few months of the year in Canada. So if you teach as a university professor outside of Canada, if you go back to Canada in the summer, and if you continue to pay taxes and you're a citizen of Canada, you can still use the healthcare system throughout the whole course of your life. So this is a way, this is an example of biopolitics. And Michel Foucault is interested in the point in history in which national governments start to intervene into the health of the population. So Foucault or Foucauldian ideas have persuaded everyone in the discipline, or that there are not major critiques of his concepts, even among people significantly inspired by his work. So people are critical of Foucault in this time period, and in the time that Michel Foucault wrote, he wasn't openly, or he was a gay man or queer man. And so Foucault's suspicions about the healthcare system and the prison industrial complex and the relationship between the two, or about a certain time in history before the normalization or the mainstreaming of gay rights. Foucault himself, as a genuine thinker, is quite a mobile target, with recognized shifts in his ongoing and unfinished work. In sociology and social theory, much of the debate and criticisms have focused on Foucault's view of power, his elusive notion of resistance, and his avoidance of normative debates. However, one area has received insufficient attention: the peculiar politics of time, chronology, and periodization that undergird Foucault's narrative about the emergence of a politics of health in modern Europe. There is an obvious tension in Foucault's work. So Foucault is critical of the ways that the state could intervene into our health and could subsequently produce populations that were deemed to be unfit or unwell. And in its most extreme, efforts to intervene in the health of the population could lead to eugenics and the rise of Nazism. So if national governments could intervene into the health of the population to determine who was unfit or not fit, then this could lead to discrimination against, say, minority populations whose health would be judged to be suspicious because of pre-existing ideas of nationalism or racial superiority. However, ideas of health obviously change over time. So this underlying anxiety about fascism obviously does change over time because of the defeat of fascism. So the politics of health and nation building do not remain the same. That when the state intervenes into our health, when there are warnings like nutritional guidelines on food, or warnings about smoking or drinking, that this is not really a form of fascism, nor does it specifically target one group of people as opposed to another. The notion that culture is the site of ongoing conflict between dominant and subordinate classes and other groups was further developed in France from the 1950s to the 1980s by Michel Foucault. Foucault made his case by studying new forms of regulation that accompany capitalist industrialization. He showed that as the goal of maximizing economic productivity grows in importance, criminals, the physically infirm, the mentally ill, and ordinary students and workers are subjected to new structures of control in prisons, hospitals, mental institutions, workplaces, schools, and universities. According to Foucault, modern institutions sometimes use violence to regulate behavior, but they more often rely on new technologies and the internalization of control mechanisms. For example, modern institutions are physically, technologically, and socially designed so authorities can easily observe the behavior of inmates, patients, workers, and students. Authorities may not always watch their clientele, but knowing that they may be under the watchful eyes of authorities, inmates and others usually act as if they're being observed. Before capitalist industrialization, control took place almost exclusively through force, but now more subtle and effective mechanisms of regulation are employed. So, what Lazzarato discusses in this essay from the syllabus about Foucault and biopolitics is really the ways that capitalism then produces forms of regulation of those bodies that are seen to be unfit or unproductive. So Foucault is interested then in power, and power is not just something that is wielded against us, or is not just something that is used against us. Power is productive. It produces us as certain types of subjects. So in our time period, our capacity to self-regulate and to monitor our own health has grown exponentially. And it is this time of normative capitalist growth that I think leads us to self-regulate and to police our own health. Power, Foucault held, is exercised in every social interaction. But every social interaction is also subject to resistance by subordinates. And so for Foucault, power is never absolute. Power produces us as certain kinds of subjects who will self-regulate our own health so that we will be productive in the workforce and productive as consumers and as workers. But power also produces resistance by subordinates. And thus, the exercise of power is unstable. Dominant groups and individuals must continuously renew power relations to maintain control, but sometimes they fail, giving subordinates the opportunity to assert their interests. So the idea that one must be constantly healthy and productive is obviously called into question, or is obviously not agreed upon, because we have comprehensive legal rights and mechanisms in place to support those who are unhealthy, or those who do not fit kind of a normative standard of health. The rights of people who are unhealthy or unwell, the rights of the chronically ill, people with disabilities, people with mental health issues are at the forefront of lots of debates regarding health and capitalism. So Michel Foucault was part of a movement in French social thought known as post-structuralism. Earlier social thinkers had argued that social relations and cultures form structures, stable determinants of the way people think and act. These structuralists typically categorized elements of social relations and of culture as binary opposites, male versus female. civilized versus uncivilized people, black versus white races, and so on. In contrast, post-structuralists, Foucault among them, denied the stability of social relations and of cultures, their capacity always to shape how people think and act, and the tidy categorization of social and cultural elements as binary opposites. According to the post-structuralists, the social world is more fluid and complex place. People are more often the agents of their own destiny than earlier social theorists ever imagined. To better understand these ideas, consider that many of us casually use the term the opposite sex in everyday speech without giving it much thought. Yet embedded in this term is a faulty set of assumptions based on a distribution of power that favors some categories of people at the expense of others. As noted in this chapter, Sexualities and Genders, it is factually incorrect to assume that men and women are opposite in their sexual identities, preferences, and behaviors. So these assumptions about norms are challenged constantly in contemporary Canada. Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and to the Criminal Code. So if one discriminates against someone because of their gender identity, they can face civil litigation and criminal charges. It is more accurate to say that men and women are arrayed along one scale with respect to their sexual identities, a second scale with respect to their sexual preferences, and a third scale with respect to their sexual behaviors, and their positions on these scales can change in different circumstances. When we think that men remain clustered on one extreme of a single scale and women on the other, when we think of women and men as fixed opposites, we oversimplify the complexity of real flesh and blood people. We also ignore that many women and men are not so neatly pigeonholed. Those who are not neatly categorized are simply defined out of existence by our casual use of language and the underlying fact that some people have more power than others to name things. While it is fair to recognize that biopolitics has a wider application than a certain break in the politics of health, it is true, as Rabineau and Rose claim, that this concept cannot be abstracted from the empirical context and specific analysis that led Foucault to portray a new power of fostering life, increasingly supplementing, since the 18th century, the old classical framework of sovereignty. Following Rabineau's and Rose's suggestions in this article, I look again at the conferences, interviews, and sources that ground Foucault's claim that biopolitics is the attempt, starting from the 18th century, to rationalize the problems posed to governmental practice by phenomena characteristic of a set of living beings forming a population: health, hygiene, birth rate, life expectancy, race. So biopolitics for Foucault is this power over life, that the state as a sovereign power claims power over life. And in claiming power over life, the state also then has a productive use of power that gives way to life. The problems from a critical perspective is that biopolitics corresponds to what Achille Mbembe refers to as necropolitics. Necropolitics meaning the power to kill, and or the power to let die. So the death penalty in North America is the most obvious form of necropolitics, but the power to let die or to divest in certain populations is also found in the politics of incarceration, and also, as we discussed in the last class, the politics of water distribution in settler Canada, and the unequal access that Indigenous peoples have to water is also a form of necropolitics. So, in the first part of the article on this week's, uh, that is listed on the syllabus this week, the author offers an overview of Foucault's position on the politics of health and its history. Secondly, the author analyzes how his thesis has been secured as an unproblematized narrative in sociological writings. And finally, by reviewing recent historiographic work, I draw attention to an alternative history of biopolitics. In outlining this latter point, I propose an earlier, more plural, and multi-scalar perspective. This revised model is not only chronologically more accurate, but it is also relevant for contemporary debates in social theory and health on the politics of health and populations. So firstly, biopolitics. Biopolitics and biopower are two of the most interesting ideas that Michel Foucault had in his time. Biopolitics refers to everything from warnings on cigarette packs to a yearly census that asks us to identify in certain ways and to quantify our lives in certain ways before the state. So there is a distinction made that Foucault makes between biopolitics as a way of governing and biopower as techniques of state governance. So biopolitics is a way that the state counts a population and a way that the state governs a population by focusing on health. Biopower refers to the techniques that the state uses to govern. And there is a move that Foucault charts in his lectures at the Collège de Français about from discipline to sécurité. So in earlier forms of governance, the state would govern by directly trying to discipline its citizens. So this mode of discipline meant that you were told no. What discipline essentially did was to tell people that they should not do certain things. They should not consume in certain ways. They should not occupy public space. And what sécurité does is to offer a kind of laissez-faire economics of security. You can move around, you can buy what you want, you can eat what you want, you can wear what you want, but you must self-discipline, because if you go into massive financial debt, if you drink alcohol to the point that you become sick, then it is your responsibility. So rather than being told no, we are told yes. And this is a kind of modern form of biopolitics and a modern form of securitization. Securitization does not work by telling you not to go outside. It tells you to go outside whenever you want, but it follows you with security cameras. So according to Foucault, biopolitics was born in the 18th century at the confluence of a number of social, shifting role of family, concern for vitality of the workforce, political, governmentalization of state function, and epistemological changes, mercantilism, statistics, birth of the human sciences, biology. In particular, the demographic transition of the European 18th century in Europe gives a strong justification to the exceptionality of the moment selected by Foucault. As B.S. Turner claims, the nexus of knowledge power was thus initially an effect of demographic changes, particularly the pressure of populations on systems of government and the regulation from the 18th century. In response to the great 18th century demographic upswing in Western Europe, a new politics of health took place through new concepts like population and the governmentalization of administrative apparatuses of Northern European states like Prussia, Austria, France, and England. So this nexus of knowledge power is really interesting in Foucault, that the knowledge that is produced about certain populations and their health allows the government to claim power over health. In its most extreme, as we've discussed, this kind of production of knowledge about people and about specific populations of people can allow for a really cruel form of power over others. And the example that I've given in previous classes is the class action lawsuit that Indigenous women have filed against Health Canada because of sterilization. And there have been several instances in the last 20 years in the healthcare system where Indigenous women have been forcibly sterilized after giving birth to one child. And this kind of aggressive necropolitics, meaning the politics of how the state divests in or refuses to invest in certain lives and births, is part of Canada's ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. The politics of health, then, the use of the healthcare system and the languages of health is, I would argue, central to genocide in Canada. In the 1979 version of the Politics of Health, we find the addition of a new paragraph to address the power implications of the appearance of a politics of health. This new politics must also be related to a much more general process, that which made the well-being of society one of the essential objectives of political power. A legitimate king is one whose aim is the public good. So when you think about this legitimate king and the public good in relation to Canada's ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the sterilization of Indigenous women and girls, the problem obviously is that this public good is colonialism, that what is being envisioned is that what is for our best, or what is in our best interest as Canadians, is to support settler colonialism. Certainly, this is a traditional idea, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, it took on a much more precise meaning. So this kind of public good emerges in the 18th century and the 17th century, at the time when colonialism is a norm in Europe, and at a time when colonial expansion is greater perhaps than ever. And so what is seen to be good is actually economic growth of European settlers at the expense of Indigenous peoples and colonized peoples. To implement this shift towards societal well-being as one of the essential objectives of political power, different power apparatuses such as police are called upon to take charge of our bodies, not simply so as to exact blood service from them or to levy dues, but to help and, if necessary, constrain them to ensure their own good health. So the police are central to this building of an ideal nation, and the use of the police to kill or incarcerate those who are deemed to be minorities or those who are imagined to not have a high earning capacity is central to modern biopolitics. And the Black Lives Matter movement has politicized the use of the police as an agent of murder, and specifically the use of the police to kill young Black people throughout the Americas and Europe. So biopolitics is a shift from sovereignty and the law to techniques of normalization that develop from and below a system of law. So biopolitics is not only then about the law, it is about our existing investment in certain populations. And the problem is that biopolitics corresponds to necropolitics. So that if we institute a set of norms regarding who the ideal family is or the ideal citizen, we also institute a set of abnormalities that allows the state to divest in certain lives. And what interests Foucault throughout the whole course of his career is how norms become ideals that allow for abnormal populations to be imprisoned or even killed. And Foucault's writing is obviously still important in this time because of the rise of the prison industrial complex and because of the use of police to actually kill those who are deemed to be abnormal or undesirable populations. So security and discipline are ideas that are debated in the works of Michel Foucault. And Foucault was interested in the ways that modern society moves from forms of state regulation to freedom. And Foucault was interested in how security operates alongside laissez-faire capitalism. First, where is discipline combined? Whereas discipline cabins concentrated and enclosed its space of operation, security was centrifugal. The apparatus of security. Okay, thank you for your attendance. Next week I'm going to post the take-home test. And so please log on to Blackboard on Thursday of next week. The test will be posted online. I will also send you a copy in PDF form through messages. So, and we'll discuss the test next week as well. I'll post it before the class on Thursday of next week. So, firstly, where is discipline? You're welcome. Have a good day. Thank you for attending. Firstly, where is discipline cabined, concentrated, an enclosed space of operation? Security was centrifugal. The apparatuses of security have the constant tendency to expand. They are centrifugal. Security, therefore, involves organizing, or anyway, allowing the development of ever-wide circuits. Second, where is discipline focused on even the smallest infractions? Security let the small things go. So security is a really interesting idea because it isn't the same as telling people no, you cannot. It actually allows for greater freedom but puts people under surveillance. And so it corresponds to modern capitalism that you are not told that you cannot buy. You are told, yes, you can buy. You can buy as much as you want with credit cards, but if you overspend, you will be monitored for the rest of your life because of credit card debt or financial debt. And your existing assets can be then taken from you. Your privileges can be taken from you. Your wages can be capped. The apparatus of security lets things happen, allowing prices to rise, allowing scarcity to develop, and letting people go hungry. So the problem with security and laissez-faire capitalism is that it lets people spend, but it also lets people starve. Thirdly, whereas discipline sought to eliminate and eradicate completely, security, in contrast, tried only to minimize, to seek an optimal level of the targeted behavior, to achieve a certain equilibrium, not to eliminate, but to regulate to the most advantageous level. So Michel Foucault was writing in France in the 1960s and 70s and the end of the 1970s, which gave way to the 80s. And France, like most of Europe, had a strong social welfare state. Education was paid for. Bread was heavily subsidized, so you could get bread for like 60 cents if you lived in France. But in the 1970s and 80s, there's a rise of capitalism and a rise of neoliberal and market-based capitalism. And the 80s then leads to this neoliberal era. So capitalism becomes the norm. And what this means is that you are not prevented from doing things. You can buy everything in France. You can buy McDonald's, which is an American company in France. You can buy American products in France. You can go to shopping malls that sell all these foreign goods in France. And you're not prevented from buying or selling foreign goods, but you are also not given any guarantees. So your bread is no longer heavily subsidized. You can go to McDonald's and pay full price, and it will be standardized prices the same as you would pay in America. So this is what laissez-faire capitalism does. The problem is that it gives way to perhaps greater forms of class stratification. That if you are rich, you can afford lots of products, including local domestic goods and international goods. But if you are poor, you can no longer afford things that were once subsidized. In sum, sécurité differed significantly from discipline in its modes of modes of functioning. As Foucault explains, an apparatus of security cannot operate well except on condition that it is given freedom. In the modern sense that it requires the 18th century, no longer the exemptions and privileges attached to a person, but the possibility of movement, change of place, and processes of circulation of both people and things. So this kind of attachment that rights once had to a person, in the form of what would be referred to as a social welfare state model, change. So in the 60s and in the early 70s, say in Europe, you would be given a certain set of rights as a French citizen that would involve, say, free education, subsidized bread, subsidized housing. Now these rights change, and you are given the possibility of movement, the possibility that you can sell your labor throughout France, the possibility that you can buy and sell things that are not even made in France. Foucault is also interested in how truth is produced through systems of power and historically. So for Foucault, there is no kind of one truth. The way that we speak about things determines whether we see them to be true or not, or whether we understand them to be true. So Foucault is interested in what the author terms benedictions. And Foucault wrote under a whole series of different pen names throughout the course of his life, specifically because he was a gay or queer male theorist who had radical views about sex. Writing about himself under the name Maurice Florence, Foucault described the organizing question of his work as an inquiry into the productive relationship between subjects and objects, of discovering the processes of subjectification and objectification that allow for the subject to become, as subject, an object of knowledge. Understanding these interdependent processes is ultimately a question of veredictions and truth games that can establish the rules according to which, with respect to certain things, what a subject may say stems from questions of truth or falsehood. So Foucault summarizes the history of veredictions, understood as the forms according to which discourses capable of being deemed true or false are articulated with the domain of things. What the conditions of that emergence have been, what price has been paid for it, as it were, what effects it has had on the real, and the way in which, linking a certain type of object with certain modalities of the subject, it is constituted for a time, a space, and particular individuals, the historical a priori of a possible experience. So Foucault is interested then less in what is true and what is not true, and more in the conditions that make something true. So if we were to think about health, for example, what produce certain conditions that make us think about, say, health in certain ways? Why do we think it is healthy for someone to work and be productive? In other contexts, could we imagine thinking that it is actually healthier for someone to not have to go to work? In other words, the question of how a subject becomes an object of knowledge is not a question about the truth or falsity of a particular subject, or subject as object, but rather about how there comes to be a way of talking about truth or falsehood at all. So the way we talk, for example, about productivity when someone is hired to work for 40 or 60 hours a week is really about the time we're in. In this time period, we might all say, that's great, good for you, congratulations. Good to hear that you have a full-time job that will support your long-term health. However, is that really true? Could we imagine that working 40 to 60 hours a week is actually exhausting, that it could take time away from socializing, from cooking, from eating, from sleeping, from falling in love, from having friends, and could that actually be worse for one's health? So there is really no true or false, but rather a way of speaking about a subject as object that produces a certain truth. The project, which he insisted connected the breadth of his work, was to illuminate these rules, these truth games, and these practices of establishing truth. So how do we establish it to be true that working and having a full-time job is preferable to not working? It was centered on discourse and the savoirs under which practices and techniques can be meaningfully referred to in the language of truth and falsehood. So this kind of discourse and the knowledge under which something can be true is what interests Foucault. So the knowledge that we have, for example, about housing scarcity, the possibility that someone could become homeless or even go to jail if they don't have a good job, is perhaps what makes work seem like it is healthy. Foucault's research on the history of prisons did not come out of criminological interests, after all, but rather from a sense that prisons were important laboratories for many of the new techniques of governance used in modern industrial societies after the mid-19th century. In other work, he documented and analyzed other governments' laboratories, physicians' consulting rooms, government census bureaus, the texts of economics, the autobiographical musings of Greco-Roman gentlemen, and the ambitions of early public health reformers, to name a few. Each research project gave rise to new ideas that are not general concepts, but whose utility is by no means limited to the context giving rise to them. Discipline and knowledge is central to Michel Foucault's understanding of the relationship between knowledge production and power. So the knowledge that is produced, for example, about work, and about work as being good for us, about it leading to a good life, is obviously about power. So if we think that work leads to a good life, yes, but work only leads to a good life if we can imagine that the only way that we can have housing security, the only way that we can afford to eat is because of work. And this is obviously a real change. In a different time period, as I mentioned, someone who is a citizen would have been guaranteed things by the social welfare state model, like housing security and food security. And this has changed in our time of neoliberalism, where we are now encouraged to sell our labor. So neoliberalism refers to new liberalism, neo meaning new. Liberalism refers to liberal ideals of freedom. So new forms of freedom allow us to work at all times. We can access credit cards from American credit card companies, even if we are Canadians. We can sell our labor all over the world. We can work online at all times. So this is a new freedom. And yet, this new freedom corresponds with a lack of security. We are not guaranteed anything by a social welfare state model. And increasingly, even in Canada, with our free healthcare system, we are facing more and more possibilities that everything will be privatized, and the things that we would have once had free as citizens, even healthcare provisions that would have once been free, will now cost money. And drugs and pharmaceuticals are a good example that certain pharmaceuticals that would have once been free are now only partially subsidized in Canada. Both Discipline and Punish and Garland's Punishment and Welfare were replete with information about the practices of governance that historically constituted the modern soul and simultaneously built knowledge-based institutions. Foucault's account of discipline, therefore, resonated with the methodological and political preferences that already existed from critical criminologists, beginning to find Marxism either tired or insufficient, but wishing to maintain a left-wing stance. Discipline was clearly linked by Foucault to the rise of the industrial proletariat and bourgeois society's need for working bodies with standardized capacities. But the Discipline and Punish story carefully avoided making capital the motor force of history. An additional factor that explains why Foucault's work itself became the victim of the success of discipline concerns Foucault's analysis of the relation between knowledges and powers, which in Discipline and Punish was not as clearly distinguished from the critique of ideology approach as would be the case in later work on governmentality, security, and on sexuality and ethics. So Foucault was interested in how the knowledge that is produced about sex and sexuality is not mimetic, it's not a direct reflection of the truth, but it is rather produced through a set of power relations. And the knowledge that we produce about sex and sexuality allows us to speak about sex in certain ways. So even the language that Canada has regarding transgender rights and Bill C-16 of the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code allows us to speak about sexual rights and freedoms in certain ways and gender identity and expression in certain ways. That supposedly neutral knowledges such as psychology or social work wield a great deal of power. Even when used benevolently, it was already an accepted point of view in the 1970s, in the left at any rate. And it must be recalled that the left was then much larger than it is today. Foucault's analysis of the role of expert knowledges in the formation and implementation of disciplinary apparatuses was thus not completely novel. Many readers of Discipline and Punish miss the fact that Foucault took the critical view of knowledge and power one crucial step further. Instead of focusing on the ways in which knowledge systems could function as delivery systems for ideology, Foucault argued more radically that knowledges themselves are forms of power. So the knowledge that has been produced, for example, about gender identity and gender expression is a form of power, and it becomes a form of police power and power that lies in the criminal justice system. So adding gender identity and expression to the criminal code and the Human Rights Act is an example of the ways that the knowledge that has been produced about gender identity and expression and the knowledge that has been produced about crimes against non-normative gendered subjects or crimes because of gender identity and expression then lead to the power that the criminal justice system now has in Canada to close down, say, a business that discriminates against non-binary or transgender people, and also to even criminalize people who commit, say, hate speech or who commit hate crimes against those whose gender identity or expression causes them to be discriminated against. So another point that is of interest is Foucault's idea of the panopticon, which is essentially a point that Foucault makes about surveillance. So Foucault describes the prison as this place where the prison guard can kind of watch everyone below. And this is the idea of the panopticon, this form of surveillance where people can put others under surveillance. So if discipline was the Foucauldian term, the greatest influence and success in criminology, the silver medal undoubtedly belongs to the related term panopticon. Like Foucault's critique of disciplinary knowledges, then, Foucault's interest in Jeremy Bentham's panopticon could be read in two different ways. The more radical and less common reading is interested in the panopticon as a novel technique, but does not demonize it, since from a Nietzschean perspective there is no innocent knowledge. Thus, this reading would not hold out any hope that abolishing panopticons in prison and surveillance would itself create freedom. So an example of surveillance in the law is this idea of surveillance, I guess, could also be about language. So if one self-identifies in certain ways and this self-identity changes over time, then are they under surveillance from the state? And the answer is obviously yes, that if you change, for example, your status as being unmarried to being married, then the state can collect information about you. If you change your gender identity or expression on your ID, then the state puts you under surveillance. The problem is, I guess, that the state and these institutions then are in a position to produce knowledge about you and to wield power over you. So the panopticon allegory is more commonly interpreted from a quasi-Marxist perspective, in which knowledges are seen as corrupt, if and insofar as they are imbricated in oppressive institutions. So the problem being that the criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex can then use knowledge to collect data about people. And this data can be used as much to put people under surveillance and incarcerate them as it can be used to supposedly protect citizens, protect people. So finally, I'll finish by returning again to biopolitics. If this system of surveillance, the panopticon, puts people under surveillance because of identity categories, then how are these identity categories bound to nation building? I would argue in the context of this class that this kind of surveillance of indigenous people, and specifically indigenous women, goes on throughout the course of one's life. The use of the healthcare system to forcibly sterilize many indigenous women and girls, which has then led to class action lawsuits, is the ultimate form of surveillance that in certain cases, indigenous women who use the healthcare system in certain parts of Canada have been put under surveillance from the time that they were girls. Their financial status, their relationship to substances is put under forms of surveillance that connects the criminal justice system to the healthcare system, which then leads to justifications of sterilization. The assumed class position of indigenous peoples also justifies a kind of Nazi-style eugenics, which has been debated throughout Canadian history. First, let us consider, once again, biopolitics, a term designed to capture the collective governance of humans that Foucault argues only became possible with the emergence of population and populations. Biopolitical strategies, from birth control programs to social security to genocide, often exist alongside disciplinary programs designed to normalize individuals and generate uniform disciplined bodies as citizens. So the first two articles we discussed in the first two lectures were firstly about the murder of Cindy Gladue, and then secondly about the murder of Neil Stonechild. And these murders are really about Canadian biopolitics. They offer evidence of the ways that Canadian biopolitics seizes upon different groups of Indigenous people, like women and young people, in order to enact forms of nation building that remove women and children and the youth from Canada in order to support the growth of future settler societies or settler populations. War waged by a sovereign against a political enemy may well inflict large-scale death, but it is qualitatively different, Foucault argues, from the kind of 20th century warfare waged on behalf of and in the name of a race or a people. So this construction of race is central to biopolitics. That biopolitics comes about at the height of colonialism, when the idea of succinct groups or ethnicities, the idea of a race that is tied to a nation, is becoming popular. So supporting the lives of certain populations and trying to divest in others is also about fantasies of race. Biopolitics has in recent years become another successful cookie cutter, with proliferating examples of biopolitics being uncovered within the sociology of health and medicine, post-colonial studies, and in theory circles generally. However, we will limit our discussion to biopolitics' relationship to discipline and the reason for the relative dearth of biopolitical citations in the criminological literature. So, in its most extreme, biopolitics uses biopowers of the criminal justice system to criminalize those who are deemed to be unfit populations. And some of the most heinous examples involve the use of police to kill minorities. Very briefly, biopouvoir is said to be the name Foucault plans to use to cover a series of strategies for bringing biological phenomenon, or rather human activity, thought of biologically, within the scope of political power. Although in fact later lectures did not explore biopolitics in any detail, perhaps because it remained largely undeveloped, biopolitics then became the title of the next year's set of lectures, Naissance de la Biopolitique, given in January to March of 1979. But these lectures, too, turned out to barely mention biopolitics, being almost wholly devoted to lengthy analysis of German post-war liberalism and Anglo-American neoliberal economics. Governmentality is central to Foucault's understanding of security, biopolitics, and panopticism. For Foucault, there is no one-to-one relation between a particular architectural technique and discipline as such, and that, more generally, modes of power knowledge are highly mobile, flexible, creative, and historically variable. As Paul Vane has repeatedly reminded us, in the end, for Foucault, it is actually practices of governance that are the object of analysis, not generalized notions that have much more heuristic utility, but are inherently oversimplifying. So a good example of an actual practice of law is abortion laws. So the Michael Dobbs ruling was one of the most shocking pieces of legislation or law it was a shocking legal precedent that happens in the United States. And the Dobbs versus Jackson Health ruling overturned the Roe versus Wade legal precedent. So in June 2022, in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the constitutional protection for pre-viability abortion confirmed in Roe versus Wade in 1973. So this is an actual example of biopolitics, and necropolitics. Um, so the impact on access to abortion in the United States of America was significant. 13 states had trigger laws in place to come into effect as soon as Roe versus Wade was overturned. Some of these restrictions have left abortion almost entirely prohibited. In Texas, for example, abortion is legal once fetal cardiac activity is detectable, limiting abortion beyond 6 weeks gestation. In the 2 months following the Michael Dobbs decision, the estimated number of legal abortions across the U.S. dropped by around 10,000. In 2022, 42 independent abortion clinics across the U.S. were forced to close, including the Jackson Women's Health Organization, the Mississippi clinic involved in the Dobbs case. As of April 2023, 7 more states have attempted to restrict access to abortion. Feminist scholars have long connected the criminalization of abortion to unsafe abortion, along with maternal morbidity rates. And this is what I mean by biopolitics and necropolitics. The state invests in the health of some, the health of middle class and affluent people who can manage their pregnancies using private health care, using clinics in New York City, which is a very expensive place, while the state also divests in the health of those who cannot afford to travel and who cannot afford family planning, like women who are raped, teenage mothers, asylum seekers, refugees. Feminist networks worldwide have been instrumental in facilitating access to abortion pills and information on how to take them. Self-managed abortion is a term used to describe abortion using the pills misoprostol and mifepristone outside of medical and legal regulations. Abortion pills are safe and effective and are on the World Health Organization's model list of essential medicines. Even prior to the Dobbs ruling, abortion was inaccessible to many pregnant people in the U.S. because of onerous ultrasound, mandatory counseling, and waiting period requirements, and targeted regulation of abortion providers' laws that led to clinic closures in many states. So the abortion debates in the states, in the United States of America, gave rise to a lot of attacks against abortion, against doctors and nurses who provided abortions. Even when abortion was legal, nurses and doctors were sometimes stalked and even threatened with death by anti-abortion activists. In this context, self-managed abortion had already become increasingly common across the U.S. Networks have expanded their efforts to help those left without legal access to abortion by providing information on how to access abortion pills safely. Unsafe abortions have always taken place throughout the United States of America. But it is important to emphasize that unsafe abortion is not the only or even primary harm caused by the criminalization of abortion. While public health has been a successful political strategy behind the legalization of abortion, it has its limits. And so I'll post this article written by Zoe L. Tung, who is a lecturer in law at the University of Leeds, which discusses the Dobbs ruling in greater detail. So the harm of criminalization, argues Tung, is that people are forced to continue unwanted pregnancies. And so this continuation of unwanted pregnancies can lead to a lifetime of suffering, poverty. Also, it can lead to child poverty, child neglect, and child abuse. Finally, I'll finish by discussing homo soccer. Homosoccer is a term that is discussed by Giorgio Agamben, and it is a term that Shireen Razak uses in the first reading in the first week of the class when I discussed the murder of Cindy Gladue. Homosoccer refers to the sovereign power's will to kill with impunity. And so Agamben uses this idea of the king and the power of the aristocrat to kill with impunity, to discuss the ways that rights can be suspended by the state. And the example that Giorgio Agamben gives in several writings is the treatment of refugees, that at will someone can be denied the right to stay in a country and can be deported. The banning of abortion is also perhaps an example of this kind of will that allows for one's rights to be suspended without warning. Nevertheless, biopolitics too can become a victim of its own success, as is happening in circles influenced by Agamben's ahistorical approach to questions of sovereignty and the right of death. In addition, to properly deploy biopolitics to analyze some of today's ethnic identifications, one would have to think hard about the ways in which cultural essences have in many instances replaced biological knowledges. In general, the post-World War II shift away from biological dividing lines and towards culturalist explanations of differences among groups, example the rise of culture of poverty arguments, and more recently cultural difference discourses, suggest that biopolitics, while remaining useful, may need adjusting and revising. Biological knowledges are no longer the main resource for drawing essentialized distinctions among human groups. So this kind of distinction between those who have rights and those who do not is clearly a biopolitical question in our time, as evinced in the banning of abortion throughout many states in the United States of America. So I'll finish with this quote from Michel Foucault. People know what they do. Frequently they know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do does. So the question becomes how this kind of politics or biopolitics of sterilization and the banning of abortion has an effect on our lives and on the relationship that we have to decolonization. So I'll finish there. Do you have any comments or questions? Do you have any views about the banning of abortion in the United States? Were you surprised by these rulings regarding abortion? Do you agree or disagree with the decision to limit abortion in certain states? Why do you think that abortion is being debated in this time period. Many of the campaigners against abortion are actually young women. Why do you think that this is the case? Many of the campaigners are actually young women and young people under the age of 25. Do you mean, why is it about control, and why do people want control over others? What do you think? Like, why do you think people want to have control over what others do in terms of abortion? Okay. Yes. Do you think that the abortion debates are about attitudes towards women and sex? Do you think this is about religion too? Yeah, that's what I was thinking, religion. What effect do you think that limiting abortion in the US will have? Yes, you think it could lead it could lead young women to drop out of school or to make less money too, and to have less opportunities to travel for work, or also less money to devote for themselves and their own education. Yes. I think it will lead to class stratification. So if someone is already working class or poor, and then they have children, then they will have less money. They won't probably have money to go to graduate school or to move to a different state. And so they will probably be more likely to be even worse off financially. Whereas if someone is rich, they can invest in family planning. It could also really affect victims of sexual assault and rape. And people with disabilities and chronic illness as well might be in a position where they cannot access abortion, and they could even become sick. And yeah, it could lead to high uh, maternal mortality rates. Yeah, yes. It's also age. Like, some of the cases in the US have involved teenage girls who become pregnant and are kind of unaware that they're pregnant until a certain stage of their pregnancy, and they don't want to tell their parents, and they can't afford to then go to New York or certain states because they're young. So they have to become teen mothers. And this will obviously affect someone's life and education and their entire life. Any other questions? There's also been some research that's been done about the effect that the Dobbs ruling will have specifically on Indigenous women and girls in the US. Sometimes Indigenous women and girls in the United States live in remote areas, so they often don't have as much regular contact to healthcare providers. So if they cannot access abortion, they would have to travel extensively because abortion has been banned in so many states. People who live in religious and traditional communities might also have already been discriminated against or face stigma. And now the stigma could be greater because abortion has become against the law or severely limited. Yeah, it is really sad. It's also really scary to think about actual medical problems and health problems. Like during COVID-19, there were several women or several people who were pregnant who were advised to have an abortion because they had COVID-19 and they would not have perhaps survived if they had to carry a child to term. So it is really scary, I think, from the perspective of public health. So I'll finish the class there because of time. And we're just at the right time. We're supposed to end. And I teach another class after this. I will post the test online for you on the 30th next week. And then we can discuss the test in class next week. Thank you very much for your participation. I'll discuss the test next week when you see it. It will be a take home, so you'll have a week to complete, so there's no real study guide. Thank you. It will be quite easy, and you'll have a week to look at, and you can look at your notes and the readings to answer the questions. So you don't really need to prepare too much in advance. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.